My name is Willow Moss, 27 years old, and I never imagined that my own father would try to kill me on the advice of my stepmother. My stepmother, Serafina, had told my father that he should just end it. This was right after he had already broken two of my ribs, the weight of his boot crushing my chest as blood pooled under my head on the hardwood floor. I thought of my late mother. I was certain I was going to die in the very house my mother had worked her whole life to keep for us. Before I share what happened that day and how everything changed, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Please support me by hitting the like button and subscribing if you've ever been turned against by family when money got involved. But to understand why my father, once my hero, would place his boot on my chest, we have to go back 6 months. Back to the day everything started to unravel, the day I realized I was no longer a daughter in their eyes. I was just an obstacle. The tires of my Jeep Wrangler crunched on the familiar gravel driveway. And for the first time in 6 months, the tension in my shoulders eased. 6 months in Poland, coordinating logistics on a cold, gray army base, had a way of making you appreciate the simple things. Like the specific North Carolina humidity that hits you the moment you step out of the car, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Home. It was a word I'd clung to like a lifeline. I felt a genuine, uncomplicated smile spread across my face. I was looking forward to a hot shower, a home-cooked meal, and sleeping in my own bed. I walked toward the front porch, reaching for the stack of mail that had surely piled up in the black metal mailbox at the end of the walk. And then I stopped. A cold dread, the kind you feel just before an ambush, crept up my spine. Something was wrong. My eyes scanned the side of the mailbox, and my breath caught in my throat. My name, the neatly stenciled W. Moss that had been there since I was a teenager, was gone. In its place was a sloppy, angry smear of whiteout, so thick it was still peeling at the edges, and scrawled next to it in a garish, bright yellow Sharpie were the letters P. Croft, Perry Croft, Serafina's son. I stood there, my duffel bag suddenly feeling like it was filled with lead. I just stared. I'd served my country under the name Moss. I'd worn it on my uniform with pride through West Point and 2 deployments, and I'd come home to find it erased from my own front door. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was a message, as clear as a direct order. You don't belong here anymore. My jaw tightened. I took a deep, steadying breath, the kind they teach you in basic training to control your heart rate, and walked inside. The house smelled of nail polish remover. Serafina was lounging on the sofa, a magazine splayed open on her lap as she meticulously painted her fingernails a blood-red color. She didn't even look up. "Oh, Willow, you're back," she said, her voice flat with disinterest. I didn't take off my boots. I just pointed a thumb back toward the front door. "Where's my name?" She let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind that was meant to communicate how deeply I was inconveniencing her. "Perry lives here full-time now, honey. He needs to get mail for his little online business. You're barely here anyway. What do you need your name on the mailbox for?" Just then, my father walked in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. The moment his eyes landed on us, Serafina's entire demeanor shifted. Her voice became syrupy sweet, her face a mask of concern. "Alistair, see? I told you. The minute she's back, she starts looking for a fight." I ignored her, my eyes fixed on my father. But he wouldn't meet my gaze. I turned my back on them and headed for the stairs, my boots making heavy, deliberate thuds on the floorboards. I just needed to get to my room, my sanctuary. But it wasn't my room anymore. The pale blue walls I'd loved, the color of a calm morning sky, were now a stark, light-swallowing black. My bed, the one with the oak headboard my grandfather had made, was gone. In its place sat a monstrous black leather gaming chair in front of a desk holding 3 massive computer monitors. The air smelled of stale energy drinks and plastic. My JROTC commendations, my photos with my unit, my collection of books, all of it had vanished. The walls were now covered in violent-looking posters for video games I'd never heard of. Every trace of me had been systematically scrubbed away. I felt like an intruder, a ghost in my own memories. They hadn't just taken my space, They were trying to erase my history, to convince the world, and maybe even me, that I had never truly belonged here in the first place. My training kicked in. Assess the situation. Control your emotions. Don't escalate. I walked back downstairs, my fists clenched at my sides. "What is going on?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. My father finally looked at me, but his eyes were vacant, as if he were looking straight through me. "Serafina said you'd want more privacy when you were home, that you didn't like being bothered by all your old things." He recited the lines perfectly, like a prisoner of war giving a forced confession. Serafina moved to his side, placing a proprietary hand on his shoulder, like a shepherd calming her prized sheep. Her voice was laced with false sympathy. "Sweetheart," she cooed at me, "we were just worried about you. The doctor says that soldiers who come back are sometimes haunted by the past. We just wanted to give you a fresh start." And that was it. That was the first time they used it against me. The most insidious weapon in their arsenal, the one designed to disarm me completely. The weaponization of my mental health, my name, my room, and now, my sanity. It was all under attack. A sudden, sickening thought pierced through my anger. If they had thrown out my awards and photos, what else had they gotten rid of? A specific image flashed in my mind. A quilt, made of old uniform patches, stitched together by my mother's hands before she passed. I turned without another word, ignoring Serafina's triumphant smirk. They could have the room. They could have the mailbox, but they could not have that. I grabbed the keys to my Jeep from the hook by the door. My mission was clear. I had to get to the Goodwill on Bragg Boulevard. Now. Bragg Boulevard was a blur of familiar strip malls and fast food signs as I drove. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat. Every family in Fayetteville knows the Goodwill on Bragg. It's a repository of military life, a place where families moving to new duty stations drop off the things that won't fit in the truck, a place where memories are shed like old uniforms. And I was praying, with every fiber of my being, that my gut feeling was wrong. That Serafina, for all her petty cruelty, wouldn't have gone this far. I parked the Jeep and walked in, the little bell above the door chiming weakly. The air inside was thick with the smell of other people's lives, a mixture of mothballs, old paper, and forgotten perfume. I navigated the narrow aisles crammed with racks of faded t-shirts and shelves of mismatched coffee mugs. At the front counter, a woman with tired eyes and kind wrinkles looked up from a pricing gun. I described it to her, my voice feeling thin and unsteady. "It's a quilt," I started. "A patchwork quilt, made from old army uniforms, green, desert tan. It has a JROTC patch on one of the squares." She pursed her lips in thought, then her eyes lit with a flicker of recognition. She turned and flipped through a large, messy ledger on the counter behind her. After a moment, she looked back at me. "Oh, yeah, the patchwork blanket," she said. "A blonde lady dropped it off last week. Said it was just old clutter from her attic." She ran her finger down a line in the book, then tapped it. "Here it is. It's sold." My stomach twisted into a knot. "Sold?" She nodded, oblivious to the world that was crumbling around me. "Yep, for $4. $4. The words echoed in the sudden silence of my mind. $4, my mother's legacy. The hours she'd spent cutting and stitching, her fingers sore and her body weak. The love, the history, the very essence of her protection over me had been sold for the price of a cheap cup of coffee. I felt the blood drain from my face. Who bought it?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. Thankfully, the woman remembered. It wasn't a common purchase. An older woman, lived just a few blocks away, said it'd make a nice little mat for her dog. A mat? For her dog. I got the address and walked out of the store in a daze. I don't remember driving the 3 blocks. All I remember is standing on the porch of a small, neat house with pink flamingos in the yard, my hand shaking as I rang the doorbell. A kind-faced woman with a halo of white hair opened the door, and there it was. Lying on the floor just inside the entryway, crumpled and dirty, was my mother's quilt. A small terrier was sleeping peacefully on the corner with my high school JROTC patch. I felt a physical pain in my chest, so sharp and sudden it was like a knife wound. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from crying out. I explained the situation, my voice cracking. I fumbled in my wallet and pulled out $100 bill, pressing it into the woman's hand. "Please," I said. It was my mother's. She made it for me before she died. The woman's eyes widened with horror and compassion. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, her hand flying to her mouth. "My goodness, I had no idea. Of course, take it. I wouldn't dream of taking your money." But I insisted. It wasn't a purchase, it was an act of reclamation. She gently shooed her dog off the quilt and folded it for me, her expression full of apology. "That woman who brought it in," she said, shaking her head. She seemed so pleased with herself for clearing out the junk. But Serafina knew. She knew exactly what it was. She knew its value wasn't in the fabric, but in the memory. And that's precisely why she'd thrown it away. I carried it back to my Jeep and sank into the driver's seat, pulling the quilt into my lap and burying my face in it. The fabric was cool against my hot skin. It smelled faintly of the thrift store's disinfectant, but underneath that, I could still find the ghost of my mother's scent, a hint of cedar from the chest where she'd kept it. My fingers traced the familiar patterns, the different textures. This rough, sandy patch was from my father's desert camo uniform from his first tour in Iraq. This smoother, darker green was from my own first issue BDUs at West Point. And there, near the corner, was a small, slightly crooked stitch line where she'd repaired a small tear. I remembered that night so clearly. She was exhausted from a round of chemo, her face pale and drawn. But she sat in her favorite armchair, the needle moving slowly but deliberately in her tired hands, a soft smile on her face. "This will keep you warm when you're far from home, my willow," she'd said, her voice weak but full of love. Serafina hadn't just sold a blanket. She had taken my mother's last embrace and thrown it on the floor for a dog to sleep on. Sitting there, alone in the Goodwill parking lot, I finally broke. The disciplined soldier, the stoic officer, dissolved. I cried. I cried for my mother's stolen memory. I cried for my father, a man so lost he couldn't see the enemy sleeping in his own bed. And I cried for the little girl inside me who had just had her last connection to her mom desecrated for $4. But as the tears subsided, something else rose in their place, a feeling as cold and hard as steel. It settled in my bones, pushing out the grief and leaving a chilling, absolute clarity. At West Point, one of my professors was obsessed with General Patton. He'd once told us, "Prepare for war in times of peace." This was no longer a family drama. This was a war. Serafina had launched a psychological operation targeting the very heart of my identity, my legacy. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, and I was going to respond. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. I folded the quilt with reverent care and placed it on the passenger seat. Then I started the engine. I didn't drive back to the house. I drove past it. I took a right onto Skibo Road, heading toward the sprawling commercial centers. I needed a weapon Serafina would never see coming. One that would turn her greatest strength, the privacy of our home, into her greatest weakness. My intelligence war had just begun. The drive away from Best Buy was different. The grief from the parking lot had solidified into cold, hard purpose. In my passenger seat, in a crisp blue and white bag, sat my new arsenal. 3 micro cameras, cleverly disguised as generic USB phone chargers. They were small, silent, and utterly unassuming. Perfect. Back at the house, I moved with the quiet efficiency of a soldier operating behind enemy lines. While Serafina was out at her book club and Perry was presumably asleep in his blacked-out cave, I deployed my assets. The installation was textbook simple. One went in the living room, plugged into the outlet right behind my father's favorite recliner. It had a perfect field of view of the entire common area. The second went into the kitchen, tucked away in the socket above the countertop where everyone dropped their keys and mail. The third, and most critical, was placed in my father's small home office. It was a room he barely used anymore, but it was where Serafina liked to help him with his finances, her voice dripping with counterfeit concern as she went through his bank statements. I routed all 3 feeds to a small encrypted hard drive that I secured inside my old Army-issue footlocker, tucked away in the back of my closet under a pile of old uniforms. It was the only space in the house that was still truly mine. The lock was military-grade. The moment the last camera blinked to life on my laptop screen, the dynamic in the house shifted. It was no longer their territory. It had become my area of operations. Every whisper, every lie, every manipulative sigh would be observed, recorded, and cataloged. I was no longer the target. I was the Overwatch. That night, I saw the first piece of intel come in, and it made me hold my breath. My father was in his recliner, watching the Military History Channel, a nightly ritual for him. The black and white footage of WHUETU's bombers flickered across the screen. Serafina entered the frame, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. "Here you go, honey," she said, her voice a soft purr. She handed him the mug and then lingered, gently massaging his shoulders. "Alistair," she began, her tone shifting to one of deep, manufactured worry. "Do you think Willow seems off? She just stares into space sometimes. I'm worried what she saw over in Poland might have affected her." My dad looked confused, his brow furrowed. "She seems fine to me, Sarah." Serafina let out a long, slow sigh. "That's what's most concerning, Alistair. The ones who are hurting the most are often the best at pretending they're okay." I was watching poison being administered in real time. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was subtle, insidious. She was planting tiny seeds of doubt, watering them with her fake concern, and letting them take root in my father's aging mind. The next morning, the assault continued, this time from her useless proxy. Perry shuffled into the living room around 10 a.m., already clutching a can of Coors Light. His eyes were puffy, and he reeked of stale laziness. "Morning, Will-o'-the-Wisp," he sneered, a smug smirk on his face. The name hit me like a slap. Will-o'-the-Wisp was the call sign my unit had given me. It was a mark of respect, earned during grueling night ops for my ability to move quickly and quietly through the darkness. It was a name that meant I was reliable, that I was an asset. But coming from his lips, it was an insult. He twisted it into something meant to make me feel insubstantial, like a flickering ghost. "Gonna haunt the house again today?" he asked, taking a loud slurp of his beer. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I just made a mental note. I was an intelligence officer, and this was data. Every sneer, every insult was another round of ammunition, and I was patiently collecting it all for the counterattack. That night, the attack escalated from verbal jabs to a full frontal assault. An email landed in my inbox. The sender was my father. The subject line read, "My disappointment." My heart froze. I clicked it open. It was a long, rambling monologue, written in a style that was nothing like my father's straightforward, no-nonsense way of speaking. It was full of overly emotional, elaborate sentences about how I'd changed, how I'd come back from my deployment, cold and ungrateful, and how my presence was casting a dark cloud over the household. It ended with a devastating blow. "Perhaps it would be best for everyone if you return to base earlier than planned. The tension your presence creates is becoming unbearable." I read it twice, then a third time, and I knew. I knew with every fiber of my being that my father had not written this. The vocabulary was too polished. The sentiment was too Serafina. He would never say these things, and he certainly wouldn't say them in an email. My training took over. When you suspect a forgery, you look at the source. I didn't reply. I didn't get emotional. I opened the email's original source code and started digging into the metadata, the digital fingerprints that every piece of electronic communication leaves behind. And there it was, clear as day. The originating IP address wasn't from my father's old desktop computer in the office. It was from a new 12.9-inch iPad Pro. The same iPad Serafina carried with her everywhere, the one she never let out of her sight. A grim smile touched my lips. She'd made a mistake, a rookie mistake. In her arrogance, she thought I was just an emotional, broken soldier. She had forgotten that I was also a highly trained intelligence officer. I have to ask, have you ever received a text or an email from someone you love, and you could just feel that someone else was behind the words? It's a chilling, violating feeling, isn't it? If you know what I'm talking about, please support me by hitting the like button and let me know in the comments by just writing, "I know the feeling." It helps more than you know. Serafina thought she had fired a kill shot designed to break my spirit and drive me away. But what she had actually done was hand-deliver my first piece of concrete, undeniable evidence. She had just given me my first bullet, and I was ready to load my weapon. Holding the printout of that email felt like holding a live grenade. It was undeniable proof, a piece of hard evidence in a war that had, until now, been waged with whispers and shadows. But I knew that evidence was useless without the right strategy. A soldier doesn't walk into battle alone. You need support. You need an expert. My mind flashed back to a conversation with my old commanding officer before I left for Poland. He'd mentioned a name, Elias Thorne, a retired Marine JAG officer turned civilian lawyer. "He's a bulldog, Moss," my CO had said, "grumpy as a bear poked with a stick. But if you're ever in a real fight, he's the man you want in your corner." My hands were trembling as I dialed the number for his law office. I felt a knot of shame tighten in my stomach. It felt like a failure to have to ask for help, to admit that my own family was my enemy. When a gruff voice answered, "Thorne," I took a breath and fell back on my training. State the facts. Be direct. "This is Captain Moss," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I believe my father, a military veteran, is the victim of elder abuse." The line was silent for a long moment. I could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling. Then, the voice came back, firm and decisive, cutting through the static of my fear. "My office, 1000 tomorrow. Bring everything you have." Elias Thorne was nothing like the slick, smiling lawyers you see on billboards. His office was a small, cluttered space in a nondescript building downtown, smelling of old books and strong black coffee. Papers were stacked in precarious towers on every surface, and a faded American flag, the kind that's seen real sun and real wind, was pinned to the wall behind his desk. He was a man in his 60s, with a face like a road map of old battles and eyes that seemed to see right through the uniform and into the soldier wearing it. I laid it all out on his desk like a battlefield assessment. The photo of the defaced mailbox, the receipt from Goodwill, and the story of the $4 quilt, the encrypted hard drive with the video files, and finally, the printout of the forged email, with the iPad's IP address circled in red. I delivered my report with professional detachment, keeping my emotions locked down. But when I got to the part about my mother's quilt being used as a dog bed, my voice faltered. A single hot tear escaped and slid down my cheek. I quickly wiped it away. Elias pushed a box of tissues across the desk toward me, but his voice was gravelly, without a hint of pity. "I don't need your tears, Captain," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I need the truth. And what you've brought me here, this is more than the truth. This is a battle plan." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something other than anger or grief. It was hope. Instead of staying in his stuffy office, Elias grunted and stood up. "Let's get some lunch. I think better on a full stomach." He led me not to a fancy restaurant, but to VFW Post 9103. The place was simple, unpretentious. The air was thick with the smell of cheap beer and sizzling hot dogs on a grill. A group of older men sat around a table playing cards, their laughter raspy and loud. The moment we walked in, the conversations quieted. The men, veterans with the quiet authority of those who have seen things most people can't imagine, nodded at Elias. Then their eyes turned to me. It wasn't a stare of curiosity, it was a look of recognition, of solidarity. An old man with a Vietnam veteran cap slowly got to his feet, walked over, and extended a gnarled hand. "Welcome home, Captain," he said. That simple phrase from a total stranger held more warmth, more genuine welcome than anything I had received from my own family. It was like a dam inside me broke. I wasn't a problem. I wasn't an obstacle. I was a soldier among soldiers. I was home. For the first time since I'd landed on American soil, I didn't feel alone. We sat at a small table in the corner with cheeseburgers and bottles of Budweiser. Elias didn't press me about the case. Instead, he asked about my unit, about my time in Poland. He told me a story about his own bitter fight to get custody of his kids after he left the Corps. He showed me that there was life after the war, even the ones fought at home. He wasn't just my lawyer, he was a brother in arms. Finally, he leaned forward, his expression serious. Serafina thinks she's fighting a broken little girl suffering from PTSD, he said, his voice low and intense. That's her mistake. She's not fighting a daughter. She's fighting a captain in the United States Army. Your instincts have been good. Keep doing what you were trained to do. Observe, record, and maintain your position. Don't reveal your intelligence. When we have enough to guarantee a decisive victory, we will strike. And we will only strike once. His words weren't just legal advice. They were an order. They recalibrated my entire being, clearing away the fog of doubt and pain. I left that VFW hall with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just a victim fighting back. I was an officer with a mission. That evening, as I was reviewing my files, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was from. Family meeting tomorrow night, 7 p.m. sharp, my lawyer's office. Don't be late. Serafina was escalating. She was moving her pieces on the board, trying to set a trap. A cold smile touched my lips. Let her. She had no idea she was walking straight into my line of fire. After meeting with Elias, I felt a sense of fortified calm. I had a mission, a strategy. But manipulators are like insurgents. When they meet resistance, they don't retreat. They change tactics. The threatening text message about a lawyer's meeting was just a feint. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Serafina, her voice dripping with a syrupy sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "Willow, honey," she began. "I feel like we've all gotten off on the wrong foot. Things have been so tense. I was thinking, why don't you come over for a proper family dinner on Sunday? I want to make things right." A part of me, the small hopeful part that still yearned for a family, flickered to life. Maybe she was finally seeing reason. Maybe my father had said something. But the intelligence officer in me knew better. This wasn't an olive branch. It was bait. Against my better judgment, but armed with the knowledge that I was walking into an observation zone, I accepted. When I arrived on Sunday, the first thing that hit me was the smell. A rich, savory aroma of toasted flour, sausage, and spices that wrapped around me like a ghost. It was gumbo. My mother's gumbo. It was her signature dish, a recipe from her family in Louisiana that she had never written down, a secret she guarded fiercely. And the smell was coming from my mother's kitchen. I walked in to see Serafina standing at my mother's stove, wearing one of my mother's old aprons, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon that I recognized. A cold fury settled in my stomach. She wasn't trying to make peace. She was planting her flag on conquered territory. This wasn't an apology. It was a declaration of victory. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Serafina and Perry were flawless in their performance. They treated me like a returning hero. They asked about my deployment, their faces masks of rapt attention. They praised my service, my sacrifice. Perry, who usually couldn't be bothered to grunt a hello, was suddenly refilling my glass of iced tea and passing me the cornbread. My father, caught in the warmth of this false peace, actually seemed to relax. He smiled at me, a real smile, and for a heartbreaking moment, I saw the man he used to be. I almost let my guard down. I almost allowed myself to believe in this beautiful, fragile lie. Then Serafina made her move. "Willow," she said, her voice soft as she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was cold. "Your father and I have been talking. We know things have been difficult for you, feeling like you don't have a permanent place here anymore. So we've decided, we think it's time to add your name to the deed of the house, to make it official, so you always feel secure." The offer hung in the air, glittering and seductive. On the surface, it was everything I should have wanted. But my internal alarms were screaming. It was too much, too soon. Perry, on cue, slid a polished leather folder in front of me. "Just a few standard update forms, sis," he said with an oily smile. "Sign right here, and it's all done." My heart started to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I picked up the folder. My hands were steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. I opened it. It looked official enough, a standard quitclaim deed full of dense legalese. But my training wasn't just in combat. It was in reading the fine print, in finding the threat hidden in plain sight. I scanned the document, my eyes skipping over the standard clauses, and then I found it. Tucked away in a subparagraph on page 3, a single sentence that a trusting person would read right past. It stated that in the event of the primary owner's, my father's, incapacitation, any co-owner, me, would automatically waive all decision-making authority, transferring full power of attorney and control of the asset to a pre-designated trustee. The designated trustee was Serafina Croft. My blood ran cold. They weren't giving me a piece of my home. They were trying to trick me into signing away my right to protect it. They were using my father's potential future illness as a weapon to steal his legacy from under my nose. I closed the folder slowly. I looked up and met Serafina's expectant gaze. "This is very generous," I said, my voice even. "But it's a legal document. I'll need to have my lawyer look it over first." The fake smiles on their faces evaporated. The air in the room grew thick and hostile. My father looked confused. Perry scowled. Serafina's eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. I had refused to walk into her trap. I made my excuses and left. The tension in the house so thick I could feel it pressing on my back as I walked out the door. That night, sleep was impossible. My mind was racing. I opened my laptop and pulled up the feed from the camera in my father's office. I scrolled back through the recordings, looking for anything. And then I found it. A recording from 2 days before the dinner. Serafina was on the phone, her back to the camera. I could hear Perry's voice on speakerphone. "Did you find it?" he asked. "I did." Serafina's voice was a triumphant hiss. Tucked away in the back of an old cookbook, the little bitch's precious gumbo recipe. There was a pause. "The brat will melt. She's sentimental and stupid. We get her to sign that paper, and we use the very document she signs to argue she's not mentally competent to manage property. Your father will be ours, completely." The last drop. The final poisoned drop had just fallen into an already overflowing cup. Her kindness was a lie. Her concern was a tactic. Her apology was a weapon. And she had just called my dead mother a bitch. This was never about a house. This was never about money. This was about obliteration. And it was no longer a war about property. It was a war for honor. Sleep was a foreign country that night, one to which my mind was denied a visa. The recording of Serafina's voice played on a relentless loop in my head. Her triumphant hiss, the casual cruelty, the vulgar word she had used for my mother. This wasn't the righteous, controlled anger of a soldier anymore. It was the cold, primal rage of a daughter whose mother's memory had been desecrated. There is no strategic doctrine for that kind of fury. There is only the grim necessity of action. The next morning, I didn't wait for the rage to cool into a more manageable form. I didn't plan a more intricate response. I let the fire fuel me. I knew Serafina's Tuesday routine as well as I knew my own rifle. At precisely 9 a.m., she would emerge, dressed for her book club, a social gathering that involved more Chardonnay and gossip than literature. I was waiting for her on the front porch, positioned directly in her path to the driveway. The leather folder from dinner was in my left hand, a silent testament to her treachery. Beside me, the American flag my father still raised every morning fluttered in the gentle North Carolina breeze. The crisp sound of the fabric snapping in the wind was a counterpoint to the ugly silence that hung in the air. It was a symbol of honor and duty, everything that was being corrupted within those walls. The front door opened and she stepped out, a cloud of expensive perfume preceding her. She was the picture of suburban grace, so lost in her self-satisfied world that she didn't see me until she was 3 feet away. She let out a small, startled gasp, her hand flying to her chest. "Good morning, Serafina," I said. My voice was unnaturally calm, stripped of all inflection, as cold and flat as a steel plate. She recovered in a heartbeat, her features rearranging into a mask of strained politeness. "Willow! Goodness, you frightened me." I didn't smile. I didn't move. I simply held up the folder. "Did you really think I was that stupid?" I asked, my voice slicing through the pleasant morning air. "Was that the plan? That I was too damaged, too distracted to read what you put in front of me?" The sweet, concerned facade she wore like a second skin dissolved, revealing the hard, brazen face beneath. Her eyes narrowed. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she lied, her voice sharp. "Oh, I think you do," I said, taking a deliberate step forward, invading her personal space. "I think you know all about the designated trustee clause. I think you know exactly where you found that gumbo recipe. And I know you remember what you called my mother." I saw it then. For the first time, a crack in her armor. A flicker of genuine fear flashed in her eyes. The color drained from her perfectly made-up face. The absolute control she wielded like a weapon was, for one brief moment, gone. "You were listening to me?" she stammered, her voice a reedy whisper. A grim, mirthless smile touched my lips. It wasn't amusement. It was the baring of teeth. "I'm a United States Army intelligence officer," I said, enunciating each word with precision. "It is my job to gather and analyze information on hostile threats. And you, ma'am, have just been upgraded from a person of interest to my primary target." As if summoned by the conflict, the screen door flew open with a bang. Perry stumbled out, his hair a mess. "Hey, what are you doing to my mom?" he shouted. My father was right behind him, his face a canvas of pained confusion. "Willow, for God's sake, what is this?" I didn't grant them a glance. My eyes remained locked on Serafina, pinning her in place. "Listen carefully, all three of you," I said, my voice rising, gaining the sharp, commanding edge I used on the training field. It carried across the manicured lawn. "The game is over." I pointed a steady finger at her. "You may have successfully manipulated a good, aging soldier who is too loyal to see the enemy in his own home. But you are not dealing with him anymore. You are dealing with an active duty captain in the U.S. Army. Every lie, every act of fraud, every word of poison you have spoken in this house has been meticulously recorded." Serafina's jaw hung open. Perry looked like he'd been physically struck. "From this moment forward," I continued, my voice like hammered steel, "any and all communication between us will go through my attorney. Is that clear?" Then, and only then, did I finally turn to my father. The searing anger in me was suddenly tempered by a wave of profound sadness. My voice softened, but it did not shake. "I love you, Dad. I always will. But I will not stand by and watch this woman dismantle Mom's legacy and your honor. You need to choose who you stand with." I let the weight of that ultimatum settle in the air before turning back to Serafina one last time. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. "You made a critical strategic error," I told her. "You underestimated your enemy. There's a moment in every fight when you stop absorbing the blows and you decide to strike back. It's terrifying, but it's also the moment you reclaim your soul. If you've ever had a moment in your life where you finally drew a line in the sand and said, 'Enough is enough,' please support this story by hitting that like button. Let me know in the comments with one simple, powerful word: enough. Your support validates every single person who has had to do the same." Without waiting for a response, I turned my back on them, on the family I once had, on the house that was no longer a home. I walked down the porch steps, across the green lawn, and didn't look back. My phone was already in my hand, my fingers steady as they found Elias Thorne's number in my contacts. He answered on the second ring with his usual gruff, one-word greeting, "Thorne." I didn't waste time with pleasantries or explanations. I just spoke the 3 words that would ignite the next phase of the war. "It's time, Elias." The Cold War had just ended. The all-out war was about to begin. The moment I said, "It's time," the entire dynamic shifted. Elias's gruff voice on the phone took on a new level of focus. "Be at my office in 1 hour, Captain. Bring your entire intelligence file." His law office was no longer just a cluttered room. It transformed into our war room. Elias had cleared off a large whiteboard, and with sharp, decisive strokes of a marker, he began to map out the battlefield. He drew boxes for each person: me, my father, Serafina, Perry. He drew lines connecting them, arrows indicating lines of influence and attack. Below it, he created a meticulous timeline, starting from the day I came home. "This is our theater of operations, Captain," he said, his voice grim. "The enemy has the psychological advantage with your father. We have the advantage of truth. Now, let's weaponize it." For the next 4 hours, we worked. The chaotic, painful events of the past weeks were stripped of their emotional charge and broken down into cold, hard data points. We cataloged every video file, time-stamping Serafina's manipulative whispers and Perry's sneering insults. We printed every email, highlighting the forged one and attaching the metadata analysis. I recounted every conversation, every demeaning glance, every lie. Elias didn't offer sympathy. He listened with the focused intensity of a historian, his pen scratching furiously across a legal pad. For the first time, the tangled, confusing story that had been screaming in my head began to take shape, becoming a coherent, irrefutable case file. The next day, Elias arranged another meeting. "We're bringing in a specialist," he told me. He introduced me to Dr. Anya Sharma, a forensic psychologist. She was a petite woman with kind, warm eyes that missed nothing, and a mind that was sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. In a quiet, calm office that felt a world away from the conflict, I told her everything. I didn't talk about my anger or my pain. I talked about the observable changes in my father, his memory lapses, the way he would parrot Serafina's exact phrases, his sudden bouts of confusion and uncharacteristic anger. Dr. Sharma listened without interruption. Then she watched the video clips. She read the forged email. She sat in silence for a long time, her fingers steepled under her chin. Finally, she looked at me, her gaze both professional and deeply compassionate. "Captain Moss," she said, "what you have documented here is a classic, textbook case of psychological abuse, specifically gaslighting and coercive control. The perpetrator systematically isolates the victim, degrades their sense of reality, and dismantles their autonomy. Your father is not just being influenced, he is being controlled. My official report will state as much, and it will hold up in any court." Hearing those words, those clinical legal terms, was a profound validation. It was an official stamp on my reality. I wasn't just an angry, grieving daughter. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining it. I was a credible witness to a crime. That evening, I was back in the war room with Elias. He reviewed Dr. Sharma's preliminary notes with a grim nod. "This is good," he said. "This gives us the heavy artillery. We can prove the manipulation. But to deliver the knockout blow, to completely neutralize Serafina's claim on your father's assets and his well-being, we need a silver bullet. Something that proves his original, uncoerced intent. Before she got her hooks in him." I racked my brain. My father was old school, a soldier from a generation that didn't trust clouds or hard drives. He believed in ink on paper, in things you could hold in your hand. He always said, "The most important things need to be kept in the safest place." And I knew his safest place, his old footlocker. The heavy olive drab trunk that had followed him from Fort Benning to Germany to Iraq and back again. It sat in the attic, covered in a thick layer of dust and memories. That night, after the house was dark and quiet, I pulled down the folding ladder to the attic. The air upstairs was hot and still, thick with the smell of old wood and forgotten time. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on the footlocker in the far corner. I lifted the heavy lid. A lifetime of service looked back at me. His dress uniform, perfectly preserved in a plastic bag, a velvet box holding his medals, including the Bronze Star he never talked about. An old, service-issue Colt 45, unloaded and stored safely. This was the testament to the man he truly was, a man of honor, duty, and sacrifice. I carefully lifted the uniform tray. Underneath, tucked beneath a layer of faded fatigues, my fingers brushed against the crinkle of a plastic Ziploc bag. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. Inside was a sheaf of folded papers. It was a holographic will. A will written entirely in his own hand, dated just 3 months after my mother had passed away. His handwriting was strong and clear, the letters firm and decisive. I read through the legal declarations until I reached the final, operative sentence. My breath caught in my throat. All of my property and assets, both real and personal, including the house at 125 Dogwood Lane, I hereby bequeath to my only child and my finest fellow soldier, Captain Willow Moss. She fought for her country. It's time she had a place to come home to. I read the words again, and then a third time, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. Tears welled in my eyes, not of sadness, but of fierce, triumphant joy. This was it. This was the silver bullet. The summons came, just as Elias had predicted. Serafina, through her slick downtown lawyer, requested a mediation meeting. It was framed as a final, good-faith effort to resolve family matters amicably. I knew it for what it was, her final trap, an attempt to intimidate me into submission on her home turf. When I told Elias, a rare, grim smile touched his lips. "Excellent," he rumbled. "The enemy is inviting us into their command center." The law office was the epitome of corporate power, all mahogany, leather, and panoramic city views. It was designed to make people feel small. Serafina and Perry were already seated at one side of the enormous conference table, radiating smug confidence. My father sat between them, looking small and lost, a hostage in his own life. Serafina's lawyer, a man named Marcus, whose suit probably cost more than my first car, began the proceedings with a voice as smooth as polished stone. "My client, Mrs. Croft, wishes only for what is best for her husband, Sergeant Moss," he began, steepling his fingers. "We are here today because we have grown increasingly concerned about Captain Moss's erratic behavior and fragile mental state since her return from deployment." I felt a surge of hot anger, but I remembered Elias's instructions. Let them build their own gallows. I remained silent, my face a neutral mask. Elias didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his expression impassive as Marcus wove a masterful narrative of lies. He painted a picture of me as a volatile, unstable veteran. Serafina chimed in with feigned tears, recounting fabricated stories of my night terrors and fits of rage. Perry, for his part, added that I was always locking myself in my room, being antisocial. They were building a cage of lies around me, and my own father just sat there, his eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table, a silent accomplice to my character assassination. As a soldier, I'd been trained to remain calm under fire, but this was a different kind of assault, more insidious and personal than any I had faced before. I focused on my breathing, a simple survival technique: in through the nose, out through the mouth, center yourself, execute the plan. When they had finally exhausted their supply of venom, a heavy silence fell upon the room. Marcus looked at me, a triumphant glint in his eye, expecting me to crumble. Instead, Elias Thorne stood up. He didn't say a word. He walked to the head of the table, placed his worn leather briefcase down, and took out a laptop. He plugged it in, turned it on, and rotated the screen to face them. "Gentlemen, Serafina," he said, his voice a low rumble that commanded the room's full attention. "Let's review the evidence." He pressed the play button. The first video filled the screen. The quiet living room. My father watching television. And Serafina's voice, sweet and poisonous, whispering, "I'm worried what she saw over in Poland might have affected her." Serafina's smile froze on her face. Elias clicked to the next file. The living room again. Perry, slouched and sneering, holding his morning beer. "Morning, Will-o'-the-Wisp. Gonna haunt the house again today?" Perry sank a little lower in his expensive leather chair. Marcus, the lawyer, began to look uneasy. Elias clicked one more time. The audio was crystal clear. It was the recording from the office, the phone call between mother and son. Serafina's voice, no longer sweet, but a triumphant, angry hiss. The little bitch's precious gumbo recipe. We get her to sign that paper, and we use the very document she signs to argue she's not mentally competent. Your father will be ours, completely. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and absolute. The color drained from Serafina's and Perry's faces, their smug confidence shattering like cheap glass. Marcus the lawyer looked utterly stunned, his mouth slightly agape. He had been played. Elias paused the recording. "And here," he said, his voice calm and even as he slid a document across the table, "is the metadata analysis of an email sent from Mrs. Croft's iPad under Sergeant Moss's name." He let that sink in before placing another document on top of it. "And this is the preliminary report from Dr. Anya Sharma, a forensic psychologist, confirming a systematic campaign of gaslighting and coercive control." Serafina finally found her voice, a shrill, desperate shriek. This is illegal. It's all fake. She set us up." Elias didn't even look at her. His gaze was fixed, with a kind of sad intensity, on my father. "Sergeant Moss," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Alistair. Do you recognize this?" He slowly, deliberately, placed one final document on the polished table. It was the plastic Ziploc bag from the attic. Inside was the handwritten will. My father looked up, his eyes lifting from the table for the first time. He stared at the familiar, looped handwriting, his own. His eyes, which had been so clouded and distant, suddenly sharpened. A flicker of the old soldier, the man I remembered, sparked to life behind them. He looked down at the words he had written in a time of clarity and love. He looked across the table at me, truly seeing me for the first time in months. And then, he turned his head and looked at Serafina. The fog in his mind had finally been pierced by the undeniable, unassailable truth. And in that single, silent moment of recognition, Serafina Croft's entire empire of lies, built on a foundation of greed and deceit, collapsed into dust. The explosion in that conference room wasn't loud, but the shockwave was immense. In the days that followed, the fallout from our battle settled quickly and decisively. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the threat of criminal charges for fraud and elder abuse, Serafina and Perry folded completely. They accepted a plea deal. Serafina was forced to return every penny she had siphoned from my father's accounts. A restraining order was put in place, mandating she stay at least 500 yards away from him at all times. Perry got 2 years of probation. But the most severe punishment wasn't delivered by a judge. It came from the community. Fayetteville is a military town. Word travels fast. The story of what they had done to a decorated sergeant and his active duty daughter became a quiet, toxic rumor that followed them everywhere. The social empire Serafina had worked so hard to build crumbled into ash. They were pariahs. I had won. An absolute, unconditional victory. But as I stood in the quiet of my temporary apartment, I didn't feel the thrill of triumph I had expected. There was no elation, no fist-pumping satisfaction. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness. The battle was over, but the war had left its scars. By court order, my father was moved to a specialized care facility for veterans with cognitive decline near Fort Liberty. Before Serafina left town for good, I met her one last time at the house to retrieve some of my father's personal effects. The smug, confident woman from the conference room was gone. She looked withered, aged by a decade in a matter of weeks. The venom was still there, though. "You took everything from me," she hissed, her voice a dry rasp. I looked at her, not with hatred, but with a profound and weary clarity. "I didn't take anything from you, Serafina," I said, my voice calm. "I just stopped you from taking what wasn't yours." There was no anger left in me for her, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The war was finally, truly, over. A few weeks later, I drove out to the Sandhills Veterans Cemetery. I didn't have a specific grave to visit. I just walked among the endless uniform rows of white marble headstones, each one a testament to a life of service. The sheer, silent discipline of the place was calming. I thought about all the battles fought, won, and lost. I realized that some victories feel like losses and that surviving the war is its own kind of battle. You have to choose to heal. You have to choose to live. That's when I remembered something I'd heard on a podcast by the researcher Brené Brown. She said, "Clear is kind, unclear is unkind." Setting boundaries isn't an act of aggression. It's an act of clarity and self-respect. It's the kindest thing you can do for yourself and sometimes for the other person. Armed with that thought, I went to visit my father. He was in a wheelchair by a large window overlooking a garden, a plaid blanket across his knees. The facility was clean and quiet, but he looked achingly lonely. He saw me, and a flicker of something, shame maybe, or just recognition, crossed his face. He didn't speak. He just held out a folded piece of notebook paper. His handwriting was shaky, a pale imitation of the strong script I'd found on the will. The note said, "Honor is everything. I lost mine. You fought to get it back. I'm sorry, Captain." The tears came then, hot and immediate. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't the conversation a daughter dreams of having with her father. But it was honest, and it was all he had left to give. I took his frail hand in mine. It felt as thin as a bird's wing. "I forgive you, Dad," I whispered, the words tasting strange and new on my tongue. But I can't forget. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it and then releasing myself from the prison of my own anger. It was an act of self-preservation. I knew then what I had to do. I couldn't live in that house anymore. Every floorboard, every window, was saturated with ghosts. The happy ones of my mother and the toxic ones of Serafina. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield museum. Elias handled the paperwork with his usual efficiency. On the day of the closing, I went back one last time. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I stood in the living room, where my mother used to read for hours. I stood in the kitchen where she'd taught me how to make scrambled eggs. I let the good memories surface, acknowledging them one final time before letting them go. I took only 2 things with me, my father's footlocker and my mother's quilt. Everything else stayed. When the realtor asked if I was sure I didn't want anything else, I shook my head. I've already taken what's most important. As I got in my Jeep and pulled away from the curb, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I wasn't just closing a chapter of an old book. I was starting to write an entirely new one. The check from the sale of the house felt heavy in my hand. It represented the final, tangible piece of my old life, a life I had fought so hard for and then had to let go. I didn't use it to buy a chic condo or a new car. I didn't use it to escape Fayetteville. A soldier, an officer, is trained to see resources not for what they are, but for what they can become. I saw this not as a payout, but as seed money. I went to Elias's office, not as a client, but as a potential partner. "I want to start something," I said, the idea having taken firm root in my mind in the quiet weeks after the battle. "A small nonprofit, something that provides free initial legal guidance to service members and veterans who are facing financial exploitation from their own families. A first line of defense." I looked at him, the concept clear in my mind. "We'll call it the Sentinel Project." Elias looked at me for a long time, his normally stern face unreadable. Then a slow, rare smile spread across his lips, crinkling the corners of his tired eyes. "I think that's a hell of an idea, Captain. A hell of an idea." And just like that, a new mission was born from the ashes of the old one. I still visited my father every week. Our conversations were quiet, stilted at first. We didn't talk about the past. We couldn't. The chasm was too wide, the pain too deep. Instead, we talked about the present. I told him about the progress of the Sentinel Project, the tedious paperwork of filing for 501c3 status, the small office space we'd rented near the base. He would just listen, nodding slowly. But sometimes, in his moments of clarity, I would see a flicker of pride in his eyes. The pride of a sergeant watching his captain execute a mission. One afternoon, as I was getting ready to leave, he held out a check for me. It was a small amount, written in his shaky hand, drawn from his modest military pension fund. In the memo line, He had written just 4 words: "For your soldiers." Our relationship would never be what it was, but it was being rebuilt, slowly, on a new foundation. Not of blind, childish love, but of mutual respect and a shared purpose. It was enough. Our first client at the Sentinel Project was a young Army sergeant, not much older than I was when I first entered West Point. He'd lost a leg to an IED in Afghanistan and was now fighting a war at home against a mother who was trying to gain control of his disability benefits. He sat in our small office, his shoulders slumped, his eyes full of a weary despair I knew all too well. He felt broken, ashamed, and utterly alone. I sat down across from him, not as a lawyer, but as a fellow soldier. I told him a condensed version of my story. I told him about the gaslighting, the manipulation, the weaponization of his trauma. "They want you to believe you're broken," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "They want you to think you're incapable, that you can't trust your own mind. That's their primary tactic. But you are a sergeant in the United States Army. You have survived things they can't even imagine. You are not broken. And you are not alone. Not anymore." For the first time since he'd walked in, a glimmer of hope sparked in his eyes. In that moment, I wasn't just helping him. I was reaching back in time and helping the version of myself who had stood alone and devastated in a Goodwill parking lot. I was becoming the person I had needed back then. My story concludes 1 year later. I'm standing on a small stage in the Fayetteville Community Center. Before me is a group of young soldiers, fresh-faced and full of the nervous energy that comes with a first duty station. I'm not in uniform anymore. I'm wearing a simple blazer and jeans. But I stand as straight as I did on the parade grounds at West Point. I am still a soldier. I always will be. I've been sharing my story, and now I'm at the end. I look out at their faces and I see the trust, the vulnerability, the quiet strength. "Honor," I say, my voice clear and steady, filling the quiet room. We're taught that honor is something we defend on the battlefield. But I'm here to tell you that sometimes the most difficult battle you will ever fight is the one that takes place inside your own home. In those battles against an enemy that wears a familiar face, your greatest weapon isn't your rifle. It's the truth. Your mission, your sacred duty, is to defend it. As I look at this new generation of warriors, I feel a sense of peace settle over me, deep and profound. The war is over. The wounds have become scars, and the scars have become a map that led me here. I had found my true calling. I had taken my pain and forged it into a shield for others. My mother's legacy and my father's honor were finally, truly, safe. My story has found its peace, but I know that for many of you, your own battles are still ongoing. Please always remember that your voice has power, and you are never as alone as your enemies want you to believe. There is always a community, a chosen family, waiting to welcome you home. If this story resonated with you, please support our community by hitting the like button to help it reach others who feel alone. And subscribe to the channel to follow the journey of the Sentinel Project and hear more stories of survival and strength. Thank you for listening.